This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres and movies from the past. Each month we'll have a theme. This month we are exploring the filmography of Bong Joon-Ho. Today we are discussing one of the darkest movies we have ever discussed on any iteration of this podcast, 2009's Mother. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. Please follow us on Twitter if you would like to interact with us or send feedback at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, we have talked about thus far Barking Dogs Never Bite, Bong Joon-Ho's first film, and his third film, The Host. This is the next movie in the sequence, of course, being Mother, and it is so different thematically, I think, in some cases, but in other ways, I think it resembles so much of the rest of Bong Joon-Ho's filmography. But I think whereas so many of his other movies are able to incorporate some degree of lightness or dark humor, like I think about Parasite. Parasite is a very dark movie, but there is a sense of playfulness at times, and Snowpiercer does have certain tragic elements and depressing elements, but there is some genre there. There is something that we are building towards. This movie doesn't really have a lot of that. It just is a very, very depressing story about an unnamed mother and her intellectually disabled son, who is accused of a murder, and kind of unspooling what actually happened is the journey that this film takes us on. And this is very often referred to as one of Bong Joon-ho's most Hitchcockian movies. He gets compared to Hitchcock a lot, but here I think you can see the most direct connection between who Alfred Hitchcock is as a director and who Bong Joon-ho is as a director.
Yeah, this was quite the experience, I'll tell you that much. Because usually I'm a very positive person and I try to find the positives in almost anything because, especially in our world today, you know what I mean? You just got to keep going and going and try to keep positive. Otherwise, the world is going to bring you down. And man, did this movie fucking bring me down. I'm going to have to watch some WandaVision episodes after this because, like, man, this was just like, I mean, it's a great movie. It's very well shot, incredible acting, but the characters, you're not rooting for almost anybody in this movie, except maybe the victim, the murder victim, because you just want to figure out who the hell killed this poor girl. And the way it unraveled, man, it was just like, well, that's kind of what I figured had happened, and it did kind of happen that way, and I was just unfortunate it happened that way. I don't want to go into too many spoilers yet, but man, it. I guess if you're kind of naive, you don't see the twist coming, or if it is a twist anyway. But the way the way I was interpreting this movie as I was going along, I was like, oh my god, these characters are not good people, man. These are not good people. But it's more about the journey and the experience. And yeah, this is going in. People warn you, this is not a movie that is gonna be sunshines and daisies and brightness. You know what I mean? It's the complete opposite of that. There are some scenes of nice dancing and stuff like that, which kind of go a little too long and a little too self-indulgent. Like this movie's too.
Yes, Brian, I was just about to say, you say there are no sunshines and flowers, but this movie literally opens up with Mother in a vista, not unlike Sound of Music, just dancing, and genuinely one of the most bizarre starts to a movie that I've ever seen, because here I'm expecting this very serious drama, and we're just starting off with her dancing, and it was kind of nice.
It was so weird because I was just like, I was thinking about that in the first 5 minutes and just like, what is this movie about? This seems like a dark movie. Why is it opening with her dancing? And then it just goes downhill from there. But it's supposed to be ironic, you know what I mean? And I get it. And it's a it's a hell of a journey for the mother, and she doesn't even have a name. I like that aspect to it, despite what some people think about like Tenet and being kind of like, like snobby and just naming your character the protagonist, shit like that. You can get away with it here because like it's just referring to her as mother, and you're like, oh, you're the mother, you're the mother. Yeah, so it works here in that respect, and the whole Hitchcock connection, and it's totally there, especially the scenes where she's trying to hide and the tension. And really good example of that is like just simple like stuff about like sneaking out of a house. We've seen that trope a lot, but when she's sneaking out of this one dude's house and like Bong Joon-Ho literally puts on the floor like all these little obstacles, like fucking Home Alone and Kevin McAllister. Instead of cars, it's just like water bottles, all this kind of shit. I'm looking at my floor right now in my room. It's kind of similar like that. You know what I mean? So if someone was trying to sneak out of my closet, they would have definitely stepped on something. And he's got that idea of how to create tension in movies, and he does that really well in this. Like I'll give him that. Like that scene was really well done. Even though I was like, man, why are you sneaking into this dude's house and trying to accuse this dude? I don't know. It was weird because this mother character is very obsessive, very borderline. I don't want to say psycho, but like it's very some kind of personality disorder, disassociation, something like that. Because spoiler alert, she ends up killing the eyewitness to the murder at the end of the movie, which is totally important, and it's this big twist, and it's just like, wow, I'm not surprised that she actually did that because the kind of person that she, in the journey that we see her, the kind of person that she is, man, it's just like no surprise that she stoops to these lows, right? And she's like desperate to keep her son out of jail or whatever, but it just shows you how messed up of a person she actually is.
Yeah, I think that the impression that I get from the movie and my kind of read on it is because of what happened years earlier, the fact that she tried to basically murder her son and then murder herself, commit suicide. The impression that I get is that there's so much guilt attached to that, and there's so much that she's kind of going through that she just has a really hard time with the situation. And I have to bring this up because class is always an important element of all of Bong Joon-ho's movie, and even though it is not as direct in this one, it is definitely an important factor. And I think you see the differences in class, especially at the beginning, when the son and when the best friend, when they're going to the golf course and they basically attack the car of one of the gentlemen who tried to run the son over, and then they kind of end up in the police station. And at first, I'm wondering like, what does this all mean? And at first, I think you could take it as this scene is kind of superfluous, but I think it does a great job of again establishing the differences in class, the fact that the mother and the son are kind of in a lower tier than some of these individuals. But what I think really makes that sequence work is that there is kind of a payoff, and the payoff is we realize that this son cannot handle being called intellectually disabled. And I don't know how it directly translates into Korean. This is something that I don't necessarily, I cannot necessarily figure this out. But the word that they use in the subtitles is retard. And I'm only using that because it's quoted. I would never actually use that term. Um, but I think that one of the interesting things is that it really does a tremendous job of establishing the fact that he literally cannot handle being called intellectually disabled. He cannot handle this word retard. And every time he is called that, there is a physical reaction by him. And I think that's really fascinating. I think that is really interesting to me just because you don't get that in a lot of movies. You don't get a lot of movies that have this kind of a focus on an intellectually disabled character because very often when they are portrayed this way, right, it is very often used as kind of this inspirational story. Okay? So, and in this case, it's not inspirational because I don't think he actively murders anyone, but I do think that he does. I think he commits what the equivalent of manslaughter. That's kind of how I read it. I don't think when he threw that rock, I don't think he was trying to murder her because he was trying to get her help, and that's why he put her where he did. But those are the things that just struck me about and just how interesting this scenario was.
Yeah, I was kind of just like at the beginning of the movie, they kind of show you loosely what happened, and then they show you the full picture at the end, obviously. But at the beginning, you're kind of thinking like, there's like a third party somewhere, because like who threw this rock, and you don't see who throws the rock initially to him. But what ends up happening is like the murder victim, she throws a rock at him because I guess she feels like he's stalking her and he's doing the creepy thing and like kind of following her up an alley. So she's like, "Fuck you" or whatever, and throws a rock at him, not intending to throw the rock directly at him physically. It's just it was in front of him, and then she used the retard word in the translation, and then she just turns around, and all of a sudden he picks up the giant rock, and it's not even like a small rock; it's like a cinder block. Throws it at her, and then it hits her in the back of the head, and she just falls over and probably dies in that instant, or and because it was just brutal the way he shot it, because like you hear it, and he's very much a proponent of like hearing sounds like that, and it was just gruesome. And then that there was an eyewitness on top of that. It was just weird, but it was just hard to watch because you felt bad for the guy, and the guy seems to have like no, I don't know, like feeling a consequence, right? And I don't know if it's due to his disability, obviously, but it's just like, man, like in that situation, like I don't know if this guy should be alone. I don't want to say that, but like, man, it was just a weird situation because he was drunk, heavily drunk, and he is a violent person that reacts in a violent way. I mean, there's no way to getting around it. He is a violent person. Um, Even though he's not being made fun of, he's perfectly fine, but he still can't control himself like that. So that's a big major issue. And the fact that everything went down the way it did, it's like there's no heroes in this movie. And even though you're rooting for the guy to not do it, spoiler alert, he did do it. And like he has like no remorse, but that's not necessarily his fault because of his disability. So it's very strange, and it's just like, I think initially the lawyer that they were assigned for the case, that the mother fired because he thought he was doing a shitty job. Apparently he was doing a great job because he figured out pretty much what happened, and he's like, your son's gonna get 4 years in an institution, and it's pretty much like what you said, manslaughter. But she's like, no, he didn't do it, and I'm gonna prove it. And it just showed you like she's not even in the same mental space. You know what I mean? Like as like a normal, I think a normal person would have just look at the facts and be like, yeah, okay, this is what happened. I have to accept the fact that my son did this, that kind of thing. But because she's not all totally there herself, she goes on this journey to find the real killer, and it turns out he did do it. So it's just like so fucking crazy, and it's just like, man, there's no winners, like I said, and it's a very unfortunate. But this is one of those movies that it's just a crazy drama, and it's unfortunate and tragic. But the thing with the Hitchcock comparison is usually Hitchcock has the good guys win at the end, usually, and like that's what The thing with Hitchcock is that he made movies that were for audiences, not just for movie buffs, the hardcore cinephiles like us. He was doing all that technique on top of making commercially successful movies, right? So I feel like if you change the ending in this one, it would be more memorable. And I think people kind of overlook this movie just because it's so dark and depressing, and then you read about it, and if you happen to spoil it for yourself before even going in, it's just like, wow, I don't know if I can handle that because it's very depressing, man. And hell of a job for Wan Bin. He was the guy who played Yoon Do Jun, the disabled murderer, I guess you'd call him. And it's just he did a hell of a job, man. Because at first you mentioned like this Kota Ibushi kind of feel because of his hair and his very tall and lengthy, and I was like, yeah, I get that feeling. And then you start, after that scene with the police station and the rich people and the golf cart and all that kind of thing, you figure out what's going on, and it's just like, okay, this is going to be a really dark turn coming up, and then it does, and then it just hits you in the gut, at the end of the all when everything's revealed, and she just does everything in her power to maintain his innocence, even though he's not innocent. And it's just unfortunate.
So Bong Joon-Ho originally conceived the idea for this movie even before he made The Host. He wrote a synopsis in 2004. and this is around the time that he met Haja Kim. Haja Kim is, of course, the actor who plays Mother. And if you look at her Wikipedia and her IMDb, she has not done a lot of film work, but she is mainly known for television. She has made a lot of television appearances in South Korea. She also has done work on the stage, and she has written a couple of books. So she is definitely someone who is probably much more well known in that community than in the United States, as would be obvious. But just to have someone like her in this role, just somebody who is almost a complete unknown, I think that's also something that really helps this movie out tremendously. And what I mean by that is, I think sometimes when you get into a movie where you know who all the actors are, like when you sit down to watch a Denzel Washington movie, like Denzel Washington, you have baggage with Denzel Washington. You have a history with Denzel Washington. You know what he sounds like. You know what he looks like. You kind of know what you're in for with a Denzel Washington performance. But in this movie, you don't have that. All of these people, there are, you don't even have some of the familiar faces that we had in The Host and Parasite. Like, this is a cast that I've never seen most of these actors before in anything else, and especially to see Kim Hae-ja uh, in this role. I mean, I just think Hae-ja Kim just does a tremendous job in this movie, and it's really impressive what she is able to do. And while filming the opening sequence of Mother's Dancing, director Bong Joon-ho danced together with the actor to make her feel less nervous. And I think that is genuinely amusing, especially after reading about showrunners and directors having very toxic sets. It's nice to know that Bong Joon-ho will just get down and dance with some of his castmates.
Yeah, that's the one thing about it's so weird about this movie. It's so depressing, yet the director's such an upbeat, positive guy, and he's like this creative force, man. And I can imagine him being on set just dancing around because whenever I think of Bong Joon Ho, I think of him smiling all the time. Especially when he's carrying those Oscars from last year. So it's so strange to me, but I guess that's kind of the creative juices, the creative flow, man. Because this is like the complete opposite of what he is as a personality, I think. And it's just like I couldn't imagine him coming up with something like this. You know what I mean? This feels almost on the border of like a David Lynch dark murder mystery, like a Blue Velvet, but on like completely darker. And it just doesn't seem like him. But man, I guess I didn't know Bong Joon Ho well enough, as I thought, because I didn't expect this kind of movie from him, and it just knocked me off my socks, man. And hopefully, I mean, obviously, Okja's the complete opposite, where it's like a family movie, but. I guess it's one of those things where you can just kind of see where his mind's at because his mind is not just focused on certain genres like Spielberg is like, family adventure drama, and then he'll go into drama sometimes. But here he's just kind of like all over the spectrum. He went from a horror movie to a murder mystery to another murder mystery to a family movie to a drama about class. He's all over the place, man. So I appreciate that. And Kim Hee Ja, she was just so like almost too real. You know what I mean? It felt like almost like a documentary at times because she just seems like a normal person that's not even an actress, and she's just like that's what a thing like that's the thing you mentioned too. Like these actors, like they seem like real people, and it doesn't feel like a performance. You know what I mean? And even though we know Juan Bin's not mentally disabled, but he pulls off a convincing performance on top of that. So everyone was on point, I think. Um, yeah, and then the cinematography was really good too. But I think with the cinematography, I think it's not the most memorable of his works. But I don't know. I thought when he shot the murder sequence at the beginning and then re-showed it at the end, that was my favorite. I think of all the shots because that's classic Hitchcock. You know what I mean? Like following a person down the alley, dark shadows, going into a room in a building that's blocked off with light and you don't know what's going on, stuff like that. That's the classic Hitchcock stuff that I love. And this is what he was kind of trying to do here, and he did that well. Except he was going for the whole dark ending thing that Hitchcock usually never does, right? And I've seen almost every Hitchcock movie, and I don't know if there are some dark endings that I'm not thinking of. Because like Rope, they catch the killer. Rear Window, they catch the killer, despite me thinking James Stewart probably should have died at the end of that movie. Psycho, they caught him at the end, even though That's probably the closest thing to Mother is probably Psycho. I think if you want to compare Hitchcock movies and in terms of like the psychosis, the mother son dynamic, that's pretty much probably an inspiration of it all. And he kind of just twisted it on its ear and gave us a darker ending, which I thought is crazy because Psycho already has a dark ending as it is.
Right, and we talk about these Hitchcockian elements, and Alfred Hitchcock had a lot more rules that he had to follow because of the Hays Code, and that is undoubtedly one of the reasons that so many of his movies ended with kind of a bow on top of them. And I think that if Alfred Hitchcock were around today, I think he would have a similar kind of feeling as a lot of other directors who are making movies like this, that they would have very dark endings and it would not be happy. And that's where I think Hitchcock is. He had to be different, and he had to be a lot more creative in some ways, because he couldn't necessarily have the depressing, unhappy ending. Whereas Bong Joon Ho doesn't have to play by those rules, and especially in South Korea, this is a country that has produced movies like Old Boy and Handmaiden and so many others, and this is kind of what they're able to do so successfully. And it's kind of a shame that we have not really taken a serious look at South Korea just as a country and what they've been able to do as far as their cinema goes. Because I would argue that movies like Old Boy, Handmaiden, Train to Busan, Parasite, this, and The Host, I mean, these are some of the very best movies of this century, and they deserve to be talked about, and they deserve to be discussed. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do a Bong Joon-ho month, not specifically because of Parasite, because I think that movie has already been discussed a ton, but to hit on some of the other movies in his filmography that deserve to be talked about. And I was very hesitant about next week doing Okja, because obviously Memories of a Murder I think is much more of an acclaimed movie, but quite frankly I need a little bit of a palate cleanser, so that's why we're going to stick to the plan of reviewing Okja for next week. But I think when you think about the Hitchcockian elements, I think this movie is able to do so much more with that. And I think the performances in this movie are generally very, very good. As mentioned, Kim Hae-ja is just so good in her role, and what she is able to convey in her face, in her eyes, and the fact that she has such loyalty to her son. But we also get to explore her character. And something else that I want to point out is that it is so rare that we get to see a movie where the star of the movie is an older woman. And we're not, when I say an older woman, she is basically in her 60s in this movie. And you don't really see that. You don't really see a lot of movies where the centerpiece of the movie is somebody who is this old and still a mother. And that's something that I really appreciated too, is that the protagonist has lived a very long life, and the impression that we get is that she has raised Yoon by herself, and has really struggled with that to the point where she tried to kill him and basically commit a murder suicide. And there's a lot of pain and a lot of guilt, and undoubtedly that is one of the main reasons that she is fighting so hard, both to first defend her son's innocence and then to save her son from a life of being either in a mental institution or potentially in jail. And yeah, I really appreciated that. And Jin Tae is kind of a goofy character at times, but there's definitely a point when he becomes an action hero as he beats up the two boys and trying to find some information. And it was a very interesting facet into his character. But I think that those are some of the things that struck me. And Brian, I don't know what your perception of kind of intellectual disabilities are in the in Asian communities, but kind of what is your understanding and some of the differences?
I'm not entirely too sure because like I have a friend that works with disabled kids, and right now he's doing like Zoom conferences and stuff with that because of COVID and everything. But he tells me like there are a lot of kids that have a lot of issues, and it's just like once they're 18, it's like you almost can't help them because they're out of the system. And this seems like an example of that. Once you're hit an adult, it's like what do you do if you can't take care of these people on their own, and she's by herself. and that probably leads to the issues of him going out on his own and finding like friends that are kind of like troublemakers and stuff like that. So I'm not entirely too sure in terms of the cultural differences, but I know that like there are a lot of situations like this here in America, and it's not necessarily scary. It's just like, what do we do? Like, what happens when we have a disabled person in the situation and they're an adult, and their one caretaker, who's their mother, dies all of a sudden. You know what I mean? And that kind of also can sometimes unintentionally lead to the homeless problem, right? So there's a lot of things going on there because there's a lot of consequences, a lot of causes and effects. So it's very touchy. You know what I mean?
I think that one of the things that separates Asian culture versus American culture, and obviously there are some commonalities and there are some differences, positive and negative. I think the United States, I think we do a better job of identifying mental illness and identifying intellectual disability. I think that the thing is, America is really good at acknowledging things, but they're not really good at actually doing anything to fix the problem or to mitigate the problem. So I think that's something. Whereas I think in a lot of Asian cultures, there is this idea of saving face, which Brian, I'm sure you've heard of before, right?
Yeah, there's even a movie called Saving Face.
So, and basically the idea is that, people who live in these countries, China, Japan, South Korea, that they don't want to lose face with people and not embarrass themselves, and to not basically humiliate themselves or their families. And I think that that's really important. And, from my experience teaching in China for a year, I had a student who very clearly I could tell had some sort of an intellectual disability. It was very obvious to me that something wasn't right. And it's not something that you are legally allowed to ask, because there's something called FERPA, which basically means you are not allowed to ask an adult if they have a mental disability. It's against the law, and I could lose my job and I could be fired for it. But this is something that I basically had to try to navigate over the course of an entire academic year. And it wasn't until literally the last meeting after everything was done, after grades were turned in, it is only then at the end of the academic year, before I was leaving the country, that I found out that the student had an intellectual disability. And it's just not something that is as well addressed in these places as it is in America. And again, I don't think America does a whole lot to deal with it, but there seems to be even less of an apparatus to handle it there than it is to handle it here. And I'm not trying to come off like anti-Asia or anti-anything, because let me tell you, if I could go to Taiwan right now and not have to deal with a pandemic, I would be there tomorrow. But I just think that there are certain cultural things that America is certainly a little bit ahead on. And certainly there are things that Asian countries are ahead of as well. So that's what I was thinking about as I was watching this movie, is that the way that Yoon is treated seems to be representative of the save face culture, and the fact that they don't have the language, and they don't have a way of working with him to make sure that when he gets called a retard, that he's not physically attacking people, because that is something it's not easy, and it's something that you have to go through the process of. And I think that something that Bong Joon-Ho has always done really well is talking about the idea of class, but that lower classes will very often turn on each other at the drop of a hat. And I think that's something that gets represented here, because even though Kim and her son are kind of in the same town and living amongst these people, you know, there is still kind of a stigma attached to the son, and it's really depressing. But I think it's very nuanced, and I think it's generally handled very well.
I'm glad you kind of contextualized that because now a lot of the motivations of these characters make more sense, especially the mother, because it seems like she's trying to protect the image of him. She's very protective of his. They don't even mention like what the disability is, and now that you mentioned, like, yeah, that makes sense because they probably wouldn't even diagnose him. You know what I mean? So that's really unfortunate, and they kind of like hint at it with the police talking about it. You know what I mean? And they're just kind of like accept this because of the way you are, the status wise, because they are lower class. Yeah, the way that you put that all together now, everything kind of makes sense why she did all this stuff. The whole saving face thing, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it sucks, man, because yeah, I mean, it's clear that he needs some guidance and some help, but there is no guidance and help. So that's probably another commentary right there about the whole disabilities and mental learning disabilities and just not be able to help people in the way that need help. And I've struggled with that too. I work at a hotel that has a lot of homeless issues and a lot of like issues with like drug addicts trying to come in and you're not even sure if they're all mentally there. Sometimes I've been punched in the face. You know what I mean? I've gone through some shit working at a hotel, so I know mental illness is a very touchy thing, and it's just like you gotta just take one step at a time, one case at a time, and just kind of deal with it. And in this case, he definitely needed some kind of help, but because of the culture, there was no help. So it's just very unfortunate. And yeah, the whole class thing too actually ties in really well because she's doing this root herb thing, very like not what am I thinking of? Horror culture, not horror culture, but just like
Kind of new age medicine, but it's very. I mean, the reality is that it's very old.
new age medicine. Yeah, yeah, and it's affordable. Yeah, and it's affordable for her. You know what I mean? That's kind of the thing, and she keeps like treating different people. And she's doing acupuncture too, but and it's illegal there, so she's still doing it under against the law. But the idea is that because of her lower class and everything, she's trying to make do and whatever. And the other thing too that with the acupuncture that kind of got me was like the fact that she's trying to like forget a lot. You know what I mean? She's trying to forget the fact that she tried to kill her son, and she's trying to make her son forget that she tried to kill him. And that whole acupuncture thing was kind of this metaphor, but I don't know if she actually has the way to make you forget things. But that was kind of the impression, the whole acupuncture thing when they were building up towards the end, where she finally acupunctures herself in order to forget all the shit she just did, and just kind of just starts dancing on a bus. But all that stuff now, kind of putting it all together, it all makes a lot of sense now.
So yeah, I just think that when you put everything together, I think this is just a very well executed movie overall. I think that when we talk about the things that maybe don't work, this again is a very very dark movie, and as much as I liked the movie and its execution, the performances, the general plot lines of the movie, this is not something that I foresee watching ever again because it's kind of relentlessly bleak. It doesn't really have a lot of moments of levity, with the exception of the dance sequence at the beginning. I mean, it is pretty relentlessly depressing. I mean, the movie literally starts off with Yoon getting run over and injured, and there's another car accident that follows. There's the mother burning down the facility of this poor guy who he witnessed a murder, and this poor guy basically has his life just ended because of that, and his whole life gets burned down. And then there's the tragedy of the young woman being killed as well, and you know Moon Moon Ajung, I believe is how you pronounce her name, and the fact that she's literally just laid there, and it's really dark, and even we'll talk about the kind of one of the important subplots in just a second here, but this movie being so bleak, and you've also got the incompetency of the police, which is also something that has aged very well. And Brian, I do have to say that it is good to know that police are incompetent everywhere, not just in America.
Yep. Even though they have the facts right in front of them, they just take the easy route no matter what, even though it might not actually be the actual person that did the murder. But in this case, they were actually right the first time, technically, so maybe they weren't so incompetent in this one. I don't know. They were incompetent in the body of the movie, though. But they did have the guy right at the first time.
They certainly did get it right the first time, as they identified Yoon as the killer from the start, but they almost got it right for the wrong reasons. Like they basically had him confess when there was no lawyer there, and it's very shady stuff reminiscent of some of the things that I saw happen in Making a Murderer. I don't know. It's a really fascinating connection to make because in that situation there was also somebody who was intellectually disabled being taken advantage of by the police, and I feel like kind of the same thing happened here. So that is just another dark element. So one of the things that gets introduced, Brian, and I'm still not sure how I feel about this particular plot line because basically cell phones play an important role in nearly every one of Bong Joon-ho's movies. We saw it in The Host with the daughter contacting the family through a phone. Parasite, the cell phones play a very important role in kind of the mechanics of the movie. And in this specific case, the young woman who was murdered had a cell phone where she apparently had a lot of pictures of men that she was having sex with. And I think that this kind of falls into the trope of the dead girl. And the dead girl is something that is very popular on various movies and television shows. And it is something that gets explored here. In this case, the cell phone subplot brings up issues of consent, as the gentlemen are not consenting to have their most private of moments in private of body parts shown on this picture. But then the young girl is of course killed for it, which is of course not an equal response. So I still have trouble with this plot line and kind of with this aspect of the story. And I don't know how I necessarily feel about it because I feel confident even again if the rest of the movie's really dark, I feel very good about the performances, the cinematography, kind of the payoffs that happen at various points, and just the mechanics of the plot I think generally work. And I almost appreciate the fact that the twist of the story is that the person who was cited as having done the murder is actually the murderer. I think that's really interesting and very provocative, especially when Yoon gets released and another mentally handicapped person is the one that is accused and the mother actually gets to see him, and it's just one of the most depressing things that you'll ever see. But this cell phone subplot, I'm still not sure if it works or not.
It's basically a red herring. It's just a giant 45-minute subplot to throw you off because you could throw this subplot out and it has nothing to do with Yoon and that night. You know what I mean? It had nothing to do with a cell phone. It had nothing to do with like a blackmailing thing. Because the whole idea, I guess, was to subvert you into thinking that one of these people on the cell phone is the actual killer, like someone that she took a picture of, right? And it turns out she actually took a picture of the homeless guy that was the witness to the murder, which makes it implied that the homeless guy had sex with her too, which is weird. And like they're not even paying her; they're paying her in rice, and it's just like what? But I don't know. I guess that he was just trying to come up with the subplot to make you think, okay, this girl, she was with all these different people. That's one of these other people had to have been the killer and not Yoon. That was the whole idea of it, but it was just a giant red herring for nothing. And it just, it turns out that, the whole idea of, like, they even show a flashback of her talking about printing these pictures out and all that kind of thing. And it just really amounted to nothing. And, like, it was just like to subvert you, or your attention, I guess, because, like, it had nothing to do with anything almost. And, like, it just felt like, especially when she was interviewing like like her fellow classmates and stuff, and she's like, "What was she like?" And then they kind of drop all this, schoolyard dirt about her, about how like she has quote unquote slutty behavior, and it's just like, okay, I get what this is going on here. They're trying to like, devalue her character to make you think that someone on the cell phone killed her, and that there's somehow it was maybe her fault or something, and it wasn't that at all. It wasn't that at all. It was just like a complete red herring. So, and it's unfortunate because I felt like it kind of trashed her character, the murder victim, and she's just an unfortunate victim. And they kind of, I don't know, it almost tried to make you, think less of her character and like, what is going on. She's got this shady life, what she's doing with all these men, blah, blah, blah. But it had nothing to do with that at all. It was just a happenstance meeting with a drunk Yoon that night, and then everything went down, and the insults were traded, and then the rock was thrown. So it was none of the people on the cell phone. There was some subplot about blackmailing all these people that went nowhere. So yeah, it was just to like, I don't know, not besmirch her character or besmirch her character, but just to make you think that Yoon didn't do it. But it was just kind of a waste of time. It felt like.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are so heavily focused on the mother character, and again, I think it's great that we have a female protagonist, but I still think that the movie does have that problematic element of basically kind of slut shaming the murder victim, which is something that I think we've all sort of realized at this point in 2021. That's not something that you want to do. But this movie's 13 years old, so I'm not sure. Again, I think that it is kind of a problematic aspect of the movie that needs to be addressed. And I think Brian, I think you almost articulated it better than I did, kind of bringing it directly back to her as a character and kind of the besmirching that happens because of this. And I do think it is a slight blemish on the movie. It doesn't take away from the fact that I still think the movie is really good, but I do think that it is worth having these conversations, especially given all that we know and given, kind of the people who get to tell stories and the way stories are told. Because the Dead Girl plotline is something that has been done not just in fictional movies, but it has been the centerpiece of a lot of docu-series as well, and some of the exploitation that I think occurs because of that. So that's why I think it's really important to bring up.
For sure. And because I was thinking that too, like by the end of the movie, like, well, if that had nothing to do with it, why do we have to go and kind of trash her character as a person and kind of question things? But I get why he did it. It's supposed to mess with your head, and that was the whole point of it all. But I don't know, like he's gonna make it 2 hour movies. This is 2 hours and 9 minutes. One thing I would definitely cut down is I can cut this easily to an hour and 50. I can tell. Like if you cut out the dancing, which I know the idea is like to kind of juxtaposition, you know what I mean? Where it's like this bright, dancing moment at the beginning of the movie and everything is just dark after that, but it's totally unnecessary. And especially when like she burns down the house and then there's this extended sequence of her sleeping in the woods and then walking through the fields and all that kind of thing, and it's beautifully shot, but you could just cut that out and it affects nothing to the plot, you know what I mean? And that's when I think as I get older watching movies, and especially like, if I was in my 20s, early 20s, and see something like that, like, yeah, go for it. Be overindulgent. Give me these long, epic, wide shots of just people standing around and shit. But as I've grown older, like, it's just like, okay, let's kind of cut this down. We don't need all this. I don't need a 2 hour and 10 minutes. You can cut this down to an hour and 50, hour and 45. So I felt like this was kind of a victim of that because, like, again, extended sequences and just a lot of the shots of mother, and then I think even the last sequence where she's on the bus goes way too long. So, but that's just filmmakers can be overindulgent, and I'm guilty of enjoying movies that go overindulgent. I mentioned before, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is like a 3 hour western that can easily be 2 hours and 15 minutes. But it is what it is. Directors like to indulge themselves, but he definitely did here. But I would definitely cut out 20 minutes of this movie if I could.
Yeah, the old Matt Waters cut 20 minutes out and make it a tighter movie. I almost feel like you could do that with just about every movie at this point, and I think that in many cases, I think that's valid. And I think when you're Bong Joon-Ho and you come off the success of The Host, I also get why you have this movie so that you can kind of really build to your climax. And I think that's kind of where I land on it. And I agree. I both agree with you that it could be cut shorter, but I also see why he made it over 2 hours long too. And I think it's because of just the way that he was building this movie up. And again, I think, look, this is Bong Joon Ho month, so I'm declaring him the MVP once again, just because I think what he is able to do so well is he is able to film spaces, small spaces, incredibly interesting in an incredibly interesting way, in a way that doesn't feel boring. It doesn't feel like I'm just watching a procedural television show. Like there is a lot of art and a lot of craft that is being put into these various shots. And again, we are in a small town. We are not in a major city. So we are seeing a very limited amount of space. And I love the way that Bong Joon-ho shoots these small spaces. I love the way the camera moves, and I think that's something that's very special to me. And when it comes to the best performance, I have to go with Kim Ha Ja as Mother. I don't I don't really think there is an argument to be made. I think a lot of the other performances are good, but in this movie that is literally called Mother to be based off of the central character, if if her performance is bad or if her performance doesn't quite hit the mark, then this movie is probably going to be bad or mediocre or completely forgettable. But as it is, this absolutely is the kind of movie that even though I will not watch it again, I will certainly remember it very, very well. And a lot of it is because of the work that this actor has put into the role of Mother. So MVP Bong Joon-Ho, best performance Kim Hae-ja.
Really quick before I give my awards, I want to shout out the Jin Gu as Jin Tae. I really like that Jin Tae character, especially when he started doing the whole rogue detective cop thing. Like it was almost like a 15-minute part of the movie where it was like a team up with the mother, and I thought that was kind of like the more interesting parts of the movie. I wanted more of that because that was a good dynamic, and I'm more into like the whole detective aspects of stuff. And they were kind of digging into the facts and everything, even though it was a red herring with all the school stuff, but. I wanted to, shout him out because I thought he did a good job as portraying like a street hoodlum that could easily be a good cop, but they kind of went nowhere with this character. He was just there to kind of be like, a possible murder suspect at the beginning, and then you kind of have to rely on him to help bail you out at the end, kind of thing. But I wanted to shout him out. MVP Bong Joon-Ho, he did a great job, and you already mentioned filming small spaces, but what really got me in this movie was filming the murder sequence, like at the beginning, like I mentioned, like I love it when, murder mysteries do that thing, and I know it's kind of a trope now, but they show you partially the murder and then the full murder at the end, and you have to kind of do that in all kind of murder mysteries. But the way he did it had you thinking like, okay, what was the rock at the beginning? Who threw that rock at the beginning? Was it the girl? Why did the girl go in the building? That kind of thing, and the way it was shot, it seemed like kind of like something spooky was going on, but it was really relatively normal stuff. It was just the way it was shot. So credit to him for doing that, and then the big reveal of the full actual what happened with the murder and the fact that he dragged her up the stairs, man, that just fucking that was brutal to watch. But best performance, yeah, Mother Kim Hae-ja, she did a hell of a job, man. It's very haunting and depressing, and I think what gets me the most is after the fact that she kills the homeless dude in his house, she starts wiping her face, and she's just like, "Oh my God, I killed this guy," and she almost like disassociated herself from the whole situation and like just was not there for it, and then comes to the realization that she killed this dude, and she starts losing her mind a little bit, and I was just like, oh boy. But that was a hell of a visual because you can see in her face that like she's going through this like traumatic experience, and she's coming to the realization she killed the dude, and she's just like, oh no, what do I do? And then yeah, it all kind of blows up from there. So she did a hell of a job, man.
For sure. So that is our conversation on Mother, a very dark movie, but I would argue probably one of Bong Joon-ho's best, and a movie that is certainly worth watching, maybe just one time. And just be careful if you've gotten to this point, and because there's some pretty traumatic stuff in here. But I'm very glad that we were able to watch this movie and review it and discuss it because I think it's really important. Even if the movies aren't always happy, Brian, I think it is worth discussing. But we are going to talk about a movie next week that kind of takes us back to the host in a way because it is also a monster movie. But it is a very different monster movie because it is the family movie streaming on Netflix that is called Okja.
Yeah, I'm excited because like I've heard a lot of good things about this, and him doing a family movie is intriguing. And I'm a big giant monster guy fan anyway, and this is kind of up that alley, but it's more of like kid friendly. So it has like a vibe of like the Godzilla movies where they were orientated at kids, and you had like baby Godzilla teaming up with a little kid in a really shitty Godzilla movie. But that's not what this movie is going to be, obviously. But there's a whole environmental message, a whole maybe a vegetarian message, an anti-meat message. So that's going to be interesting for us, considering we're heavy meat eaters. Hopefully, we're not feeling guilty as hell at the end of the movie, but we'll see. Because I don't think I would eat. I would never eat an animal that looks like Okja anyway. It's just too cute. So
Yes, so that is very exciting. And then we are going to announce our plans for March, April, and May as well next week as we kind of have an idea of what we're going to be doing over the course of the next couple months as winter continues here in the South. And Brian, I'm always a little jealous of you at this point because in California, unless it's raining, it's 70 degrees or above, right?
as of right now, I think it's 72. It rained 2 weeks ago for I don't know, like 6 hours. And yeah, that's pretty much where we're at right now. I don't get this whole thing about the groundhog because I don't think the groundhog counts on California time. Because California time right now, I think we're at the beginning of spring, or maybe even halfway through it at this point in our. It's nuts. But the environment, right? It's all about the environment, as we talk about next week.
It is. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening to us once again. We will talk to you next week when we discuss Oakjaw.
I think I'm gonna cook a steak while watching Oakjaw. Is that weird?